Well, my thoughts are on the way, dears. If you'll cast your minds back to a couple of months ago, you may remember that I made a video about my worries about Doubtfire. That video was very much like, these are my concerns. These are my worries without having seen the musical. And a lot of these concerns that I brought up in that video would only be able to be fully addressed after seeing the musical. I've seen it now. And a lot of people have been asking for my thoughts. It's just taken me a while because as I tried to make the video, my laptop broke. So, yeah. So, I'm going to split this video into two. The first part of the video is going to be talking about the musical itself. And then I'm going to go on to addressing some of my concerns from that original video. Mrs. Doubtfire is one of those films that is completely made by its original actor. So the essence of trying to do Mrs. Doubtfire without Robin Williams feels like it just wouldn't work. And on stage, it doesn't really work. But why? What didn't work about Mrs. Doubtfire? What did translate well to the stage? What were the parts of it that I most enjoyed? Let's find out. But if you haven't seen my face before, hi, I'm Ellie. I talk about theatre. I do reviews, I do discussions, I do video essays, and if any of that sounds interesting to you, please consider hitting like and subscribe. It really helps me out, it helps out the channel. But let's talk about why I wasn't really sold on Doubtfire. This show is very faithful to the film, and you can tell through its entire inception that it is trying to appeal to the fans of the film. And that's fine. Sometimes these type of musicals are more designed for your general public, rather than like the die-hard musical theatre fans. And that feels like very much the audience that Doubtfire is going for. But the thing is, the strongest moments in this musical are honestly the moments where they try and stray away. They try and give the actors a chance to put their own spin onto the original parts of Doubtfire. My favourite scenes are always the scenes where they strayed away from this. Like the loop machine scene, for example, where they give Gabriel Vick, who plays Doubtfire, something different to do, something that he gets to put his own essence into, and it isn't really stuck behind having to be Robin Williams. You can tell that they were really pushed to kind of keep close to this film, and it doesn't really work because of the main issue of if you are not completely as good as Robin Williams, if you are not as iconic and as funny as Robin Williams, it's not really going to work. And that's why something like Groundhog Day, which has a very similar issue, with Bill Murray's performance in that film being one of the main factors that makes it so iconic, but Groundhog Day kind of takes that and twists it and gives Andy Karl his own space and his own breathing room to play around with it and give his own version of it. It doesn't really feel like Doubtfire gives the same to Gabriel Vick. It is so hard to recapture that magic that it just has to be different. Not unrecognisable, not completely reinvented, just slightly different, slightly your own. Now, there's a lot of elements about the film that also do really work. If you put aside Robin Williams for a second, I think the part of the film that really appeals to people is the whole divorce plot. When Mrs. Doubtfire came out, there were a lot of films that were being made about divorce, and like, you can put your parents back together. Think of something like Parent Trap, for example. But there weren't very many films designed for family audiences that were saying that, you know, families look different. It's okay if your parents are divorced. It's okay if these things are happening to you. It's not your fault, and your parents still love you. It's that ending speech that Mrs. Doubtfire gives that I feel like still really holds up to this day. And even with a more modern perspective on it, you get that sense from it of found family, of families looking different. It's some families have 2 mummies, 2 daddies, 50 million grandparents. It doesn't really matter as long as there is love. That translates really well to stage. However, a lot of that is found in Act 2. Act 1 rushes a lot of the plot. And because of that, there's not really much of that emotional attachment to really grip onto as an audience member. But in Act 2, when they really give the time to these ideas to, you know, developing the family, developing the relationship between Daniel and his daughter, Lydia, these are the moments that really work well and make Act 2 feel a lot stronger than Act 1. The other thing is the comedy. Now, look, there are a lot of jokes that you can't avoid having in a Doubtfire musical. I understand that. You've got to have the help is on the way, dear. You've got to have the run by fruiting. You've got to have all of these jokes that are so iconic to the film. However, it feels like these jokes are put in and the ones that are new for the musical don't really work. Making the original jokes from the film stand out like a sore thumb. I would call it a humorous musical rather than a laugh out loud funny musical. There are a lot of good jokes in there, and obviously the jokes from the original film still do work. But when your strongest material is all jokes that I've already heard from the original film, it's still funny, but there's nothing new really there for me to find humorous. And what's more, a lot of the jokes that they add into the musical are very repetitive. There's one joke that happens with Daniel's brother, played by Cameron Blakely, where every time he says something that's a lie, he shouts it. This joke is repeated throughout the entire musical. And even within Act 1, it gets old. The new material just doesn't really land as well. Another very weird touch that this musical does is it moves the story to modern day. I mean, sure, but it doesn't really justify this movement. There is, like, one additional reference to mobile phones and the internet in one scene, but other than that, it feels like this could still be set in the 90s and work just as well. It's a very odd movement that I'm not sure why it was done. I'd say I'm very mixed on the book as a whole. There's some really strong moments. There's some really fun things that they throw in there. My favourite moments were definitely the points of the plot where they try and stray away from the film, where they give Mrs. Doubtfire new things to do, new situations to be in, adding more life into this concept. But it definitely feels like it relies a little bit too much on those remember berries, on those iconic quotes from the film that sometimes even feel like they're kind of shoved in there because they have to be there. But still, with all that, I think the book was entertaining enough. Even though it's rushed in places, it does carry a strong emotional beat in Act 2. And there's enough there to find humorous. I can't say the same, however, about the score. This is a extremely weak score. It's unfortunate because a lot of the moments from Doubtfire feel like they would translate really well into a musical, but there's not really many songs that I even remember. I think the strongest piece of material in this show is the finale song, and that's great, okay? Stick the landing, well done. As Long as There Is Love is a really nice song. It's sweet, it's catchy. And there's some other nice songs in there. I like the ballads, I like Let Go. I like Just Pretend, which comes towards the end for Lydia and Daniel. And I really enjoyed the loop song that Daniel does. But I don't think the score has much of an identity. It's a pretty forgettable and inconsequential score. And I definitely felt myself preferring a lot of the scenes over the songs. There are some songs that you can forgive because of the fun staging, like Easy Peasy. I'm not massive on the song itself, but the way that they stage it and bring it to life is a lot of fun. The song, it's fine, it's serviceable. I wouldn't ever listen to it outside of the context of the musical, but the way that they stage it with all of the ensemble members and these big flashy dance sequences and the tap, and they really throw everything into it, and it's a very visually interesting section of the show. But I think what happens with this music is that none of it really makes an impact, except for that final song, which really leans into the emotional ideas of the musical and of the original film, taking that line from Robin Williams' final speech, "As long as there is love," and baking it into a song. But on the whole, this score just kind of makes you wish that they were just doing a Mrs. Doubtfire play instead of a Mrs. Doubtfire musical. Look, some shows can get away with having a weak book, but it's really hard to get away with having a weak score. The staging of this show is fine, it's what you'd expect. And I would say that on the whole, there's a lot of great choreography in this show. As I said, easy peasy, great example of this. And honestly, I quite like the set design. The house is simple, looks cute, very reminiscent of the film's location. I think a lot of commendments needs to go towards the design of Doubtfire and how quickly and efficiently they can do this. But I feel like at some points the Doubtfire mask really restricts the movement of the actor's face. Whenever Gabriel Vick is in the Doubtfire mask, it's really hard for them to properly emote. I wasn't that far back. I was only in the second row of the dress circle, and still whenever she was wearing that Doubtfire mask, I wasn't really getting much out of their facial expressions, unfortunately. It's a little bit more of a nitpick because I don't really know what they could have done to really fix it and still have that very, Doubtfire design. It's just something I wanted to note. But let's talk about this cast, starting with Gabriel Vick. Vick has such an impossible task in this show, because you've got to live up to Robin Williams, and that is almost impossible. And I will give him credit where credit is due. He does a great job. But I would say it's the moments where he's allowed to kind of go off the handle and do his own thing where he really feels like he shines. He does a good impression of Mrs. Doubtfire. It feels nice. But it doesn't really feel like there's much room within that part for him to grow out. It's within the sections where he's actually playing Daniel where I preferred his performance. When he's messing around on a loop machine, when he's talking to his kids, where he's showing that emotional vulnerability. That's why I find myself attaching to him as a character. And honestly, Vick does a very good job at balancing going between Doubtfire and Daniel at such an impressive rate, which has to be commended. Laura Tebbutt plays Miranda. It's a very safe performance. It's a good Sally Field impression. She gets a nice emotional ballad in the song Let Go. Cara Dixon Hernandez plays Lydia, and I really enjoyed her performance. She feels like a very nice emotional heart to the family, and honestly, I wish she got more to do. I think her presence at the show as kind of this in-between between the mother and the father could have been fleshed out a little bit more, and given Carla even more moments to show herself off as the great performer that she is. Cameron Blakely and Marcus Collins play Frank and Andre respectively. I like how they've taken these roles and really expanded them from the film. If you remember, Cameron Blakely's character is originally played by Harvey Fierstein, and in the film, he's a pretty much little cameo role. And they've expanded them a little bit and given them a little bit of a subplot on wanting to adopt a child. It's nice, and the two actors play off each other very well. It's just a shame that I feel like some of their material grows a little bit stale as the musical goes on because of how much it repeats. And as well as this, there's some nice supporting performances from Samuel Edwards, who plays Stuart, and Kelly Abao, who plays Wanda, who both get a lot of moments to really shine and add some more depth to the characters from the original film. Doubtfire itself, as a musical, I'm not sure it really works that well. But let's talk about the trans question now. If you missed my other video, I spoke about how a lot of people in the trans community were a little bit worried about shows like Mrs. Doubtfire. We've seen a big rise in shows recently that have kind of pointed and laughed at the idea of men in dresses. This type of comedy can often be seen as a little bit low bar, a little bit offensive nowadays, because it feels like you are very much making fun of the trans community, namely gender non-conforming people. But the issue that affects me more as a trans woman is the whole idea of the plot of Doubtfire. The idea of a man dressing as a woman in order for something of their own personal gain. I don't think Doubtfire is the worst example of this. Musicals like Tootsie are like 10 times worse because of what the character is trying to gain. The character of Daniel just wants to be with his kids. Just wants to be with his family, which is a lot more admirable from an audience perspective than an angry actor who is mad that they're not getting roles. But that idea of a man dressing as a woman in order to get something for their own personal gain is the narrative that a lot of TERFs go with to belittle us and to justify, you know, transphobia. And as well as that, there's a lot of elements from the original film that have not aged well. So the question becomes, now that I've seen Doubtfire, what is my perspective on this? I think the musical does what it can do, for the most part. There are still a couple of elements within the musical, and I will address these, which definitely left me feeling uncomfortable. But I think it does change a lot of the things from the original film that they could. For example, one of the most uncomfortable scenes, for me personally, if I go back and watch Doubtfire, is the bathroom scene. This moment has not aged well. It has not aged well, and it's very uncomfortable. And the musical changes this so that now the son finds out because Mrs. Doubtfire is in the bathroom putting baby powder underneath the mask, which works a lot better and is a much stronger moment. The moments where I was a bit more uncomfortable with it were actually some of the things that they've added in. There's a song in Act 1 called Make Me a Woman, and it is Cameron Blakely's character and Marcus Collins' character putting Daniel into the Mrs. Doubtfire character for the first time. And they're trying to find what type of woman Doubtfire is. And all of the female ensemble members come out as these like beautiful icons like Diana and Cher. But then when Daniel says that Mrs. Doubtfire is older, it's the male cast members who come out dressed as older women. This moment is one of the closest bits in the show to that kind of men in dress, ha ha ha, laugh at it, that's not normal, kind of joke. It's not a good moment, and I wish they would just rework it. There is a similar moment in Act 2 that I did see some criticism towards, but honestly, I don't mind it as much, which is during this dream sequence where all of the ensemble appear as Mrs. Doubtfire. This moment is different for me personally because everyone is Mrs. Doubtfire. The joke here isn't that the male cast members are dressing up as women and ha ha ha, that's not normal. The joke is that there is so many Mrs. Doubtfires and everyone is Mrs. Doubtfire. Everyone's on a similar playing field. The joke isn't making fun of gender non-conforming people. But for the most part, they have done the work. I don't think a lot of the comedy is put on the shoulders of, ha ha ha, Daniel is dressing as Mrs. Doubtfire, isn't that funny? Laugh at the man in the dress. I don't think a lot of the humour comes from that. I think when you compare it to other shows with a similar premise, this one kinda gets away with it a little bit more than the other ones. It definitely has some, you know, problematic moments. I could definitely see trans people watching this and being very uncomfortable. There were definitely moments where I was watching this and I was deeply uncomfortable. The other moment I wish they would slightly adapt is the reveal of Doubtfire being Daniel in the restaurant. They do the typical scene where Doubtfire is going between the two parties, the work conference and the family dinner, and constantly switching between the two. And in the film, he runs across and the mask falls off. But in the musical, he does this weird spin. It's really weirdly staged and doesn't work, and the entire dress and mask fall off. And Daniel is just standing there in the kind of bodysuit. This is another moment where it doesn't really work, and I don't even think the joke works either, because the execution is a little bit rough. And I think having a more simpler, or even just the mask falling off, would have probably been more effective. Doubtfire is it's a weird one to review. Because on the whole, it's not a very strong musical. It's fine. It is perfectly fine. If you are a fan of the film and you want to see the film on stage, you are going to get all the enjoyment you want out of Mrs. Doubtfire, probably. If you want something to really take the idea of Doubtfire and adapt it and to make it really fit onto stage, this is not the musical for you. It feels like it's just kind of been put on stage and they've kind of given it a thumbs up and walked away. And in a time where we're seeing loads of musical film adaptations like Beetlejuice, like Groundhog Day, that are really taking the time to make sure the material really works on stage, Doubtfire really feels like an outlier because of that. And while I'm glad that some of the material from the film that made me quite uncomfortable has been reworked, I still think there's a couple of things that they could have probably tweaked a little bit. But what do you think? Have you seen Doubtfire? What are your thoughts on it? Let me know all of your thoughts in the comments down below. If you did enjoy this video, please consider hitting like and subscribe. It really helps me out, it helps out the channel. Here's some links to my other videos on screen right now, and a link to my Instagram if you want to drop me a follow over there. But that's it for me today, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!